you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, I really appreciate your taking the time to give such detailed responses to my questions. It's definitely helpful to orient our conversation for today. I'm wondering, out of everything that you raised, out of all the questions you brought up, if there was one thing that would change everything about your prep going forward, if this conversation were the starting point of a massive transformation in your understanding of the LSAT, what would need to happen for you?
I guess maybe speed, but maybe that's still too early to try to calculate within me doing this. But I think me going faster would definitely help me with this process.
Yeah, going faster, that's huge, of course. The LSAT has such a big time component. I'm wondering if there's a particular section of the LSAT or a particular timing struggle you have where we could focus. Is there a certain section that gives you particular trouble?
To be honest, I feel like I still need help in all three. I kind of get gains in logical reasoning, but reading comprehension may be hard for me, just trying to read all of those paragraphs and get them and trying to understand them in that time limit. But I think all three I really need help with.
Sure. We could talk about all three and start with reading comp, for example. And I appreciate your sending over such detailed notes and photos of what you're doing on reading comp. And it looked to me like for reading comp, you're underlining and highlighting quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. So I can try to stay in tune with what I'm reading, so I won't go off and, just to try to better understand what I'm reading. That's the goal for underlining and all of that stuff.
Yeah, of course. Do you find that what you underline or what you mark off or circle, do you find that it actually does end up helping you in the end?
Yes and no. It does help me go back to find what I'm looking for. I don't think it really helps me understand what I'm reading while I'm reading it, but just to help mark what's important and to know that I can go back to that area to find it, that does help.
Right. I understand what you're saying. How much time do you invest in making these markings at the beginning of each passage?
I don't invest that much time. I just go as I read. I don't really invest that much time. If I think it's important, I'll just underline it.
Okay, cool. If we were to, is it 2 minutes, 3 minutes? What does it look like? Have you ever timed it?
No, I haven't timed it. Like what? Like while I'm reading it or?
Yeah, so like let's say you're doing 4 passages in the reading comprehension section. You have on average just under 9 minutes per passage.
Mm-hmm.
So within that 9 minutes per passage on average, how many minutes are you spending on your markings and your initial read of the passage versus the questions?
I have not timed it, but I would guess and say about 5 or more minutes.
Okay. This is something good to think about. And you might want to, as an exercise, try timing it. Mm-hmm. Because to me, 5 minutes sounds like a lot, actually. And I know 5 minutes is not that much considering how dense this text is, right? But right. If you spend 5 minutes on your initial read of the passage, then you only have about 4 minutes to do all 7 questions associated. So you've got 30 seconds per question.
Mm-hmm.
And those questions are hard.
Right.
So what do you think could happen for you if you reframed it a little bit? And let's say you put 2-3 minutes in your initial read of the passage, and then you would have 6 or 7 minutes for the questions. How might that change your flow as you go through the passage?
I guess it will make me go quicker, definitely. I'm not sure if I would be able to understand everything as I go, but I would just try to make sure that I do understand everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's, of course, a lot of details, and you might not want to digest them all at once, all up front. But what if you were to focus on the big picture, the main idea, the primary purpose, the author's opinion, and then for all those nitty-gritty details, you don't necessarily absorb them in the moment, but at least you know where they are to go back and find them when you need to solve particular questions. How could that change things for you?
That makes sense. Just having my frame of mind that I'm only reading for a certain purpose and not trying to read everything and gain all of the information at one time. So if I have an idea to just go in for the main purpose and just try to separate everything, I think that could definitely help.
Okay, great. Awesome. Now you talked a bit about getting ready for test day. When are you taking the LSAT?
June.
Okay. You were asking about, should you do time tests at this point? If so, how many a week?
Mm-hmm.
How many have you been doing right now so far on average?
I've been scared. I haven't done
it. Obviously, it's very natural. You're not alone in that. But what exactly makes you scared to take a timed exam?
Just feeling like I'm going to stop in the middle and not complete it, and just, I don't know, I guess all of the information is kind of scary. But now that I'm getting to understand it a little bit better, it's not as scary, but I still haven't taken the full-time test yet.
Yeah, no, it is scary. And of course, the early results can definitely be discouraging. They certainly were for me. My first dozen or so exams I did timed, I was consistently hitting my lowest scores over and over and over. And it made me feel dumb, and it was frustrating. And it turned out that I hadn't really fully grasped the fundamentals before doing those timed exams. And I think of the LSAT as being like a foreign language. So if you get a low score, all that tells you is that you haven't learned that language yet. You're not yet proficient, but you can with time. And of course, we've got about 2 months until June, plenty of time to undergo a transformation in your understanding of this exam. But you talked about, I want to focus on exactly what you said here, not just to share my story, but you talked about stopping in the middle and not finishing it.
Right.
What would get in the way of you finishing it?
Just me spending a lot of time on one question.
Yeah, I hear you. Now, so if you were to sit down and do a timed exam, that would be, of course, the 5 35-minute sections, including a break in the middle. It might take around 3 hours or so.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you knew that you had the clock ticking and you had that time counting down, what could you do if you find yourself getting bogged down? Breathe, yes. Breathing is key.
While I'm taking the test, what can I do?
Yeah, what can you do to just keep yourself pushing ahead?
Just take a break, I guess a mental break from it, a 5-second mental break.
Yeah, definitely.
Encourage myself, maybe.
Sure, those are all great solutions. I'm not even giving you anything here. You're just saying these on your own. That's awesome. One other thing does come to mind, and that idea is to just let go of that question.
Okay.
Just skip that question, move on, hope to come back to it later. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But you don't necessarily need to get every single question correct to get a decent score.
Okay.
It's a funny thing, but you can get 10 questions wrong or so and still get a 170, which is the top 3% of all test takers. It's a crazy curve on this exam. It's not reasonable. Mm-hmm. This exam is not meant for most people to be able to finish it in the time allotted. And getting bogged down is really natural. It's a really natural position to be in. And so if you're getting stuck on something, you could just drop it, move on to the next one, and hope to come back to it later. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but at least you didn't get yourself bogged down on something that wasn't worth your time.
Right. That makes sense.
Now, if you're doing an untimed exam, that's a different story, of course, because untimed, you could take a day, you could take a week to do one exam, right? If you just puzzle over it again and again and again. So what I would encourage you to do there is maybe do an untimed section. And so if obviously timed would typically be 35 minutes, maybe untimed it takes double or triple or even quadruple that amount of time. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. So quadruple times the 35-minute section would be maybe 2.5 hours or so almost. And that's a good solid study period, right? But to do that for 5 sections would take something like 11 or 12 hours maybe. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't suggest doing that, because if you're being the typical future lawyer type A perfectionist who wants to get everything right, you could sit there for 12 hours straight and do exams. People do that, and it's not a great idea. So maybe just do an untimed section to start, and take it from there. And then when you want to introduce timing, do a timed section and take it from there. I think that the LSAT, there's 3 phases to studying. There's accuracy, which is untimed. Then there's pacing, which is doing individual timed sections. And then there's endurance with the full length 5-section exams. But it comes in stages and you don't want to necessarily get ahead of yourself.
Right.
That being said, I do think there's value in doing some timed exams now. You don't want to save all your timed exams and all your endurance practice for the final month or the final couple weeks. Now, what do you do, Dave? Are you in school? Are you working? How do you fill your days aside from the LSAT?
I'm working. I'm a full-time paralegal. I have a full-time job. Other than that, I don't really do anything. But it seems like my days go by pretty quick. Like I try to go to the gym. I do try to put some study time in. And I like to sleep, so I like to get 8 hours of sleep. But the days seem to run by pretty fast. I don't have any kids or anything, but the days still go by pretty fast.
Yeah, sure. Well, given that you're working, given that you're working full-time 40-hour week,
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you want to do a timed exam on a weekend day, maybe a Saturday or a Sunday each week. Of course, you want to do it relatively early, because if you do it in the evening, especially after work, you're tired, you're not going to be performing at your best. And so I'd say typically do it relatively early in the morning or maybe early afternoon. I believe the June exam's in the afternoon, right? Mm-hmm. So you could do it around 1 o'clock, which is the same time the exam itself will be. And so that way you're used to everything related to that time of day. Even, for example, like, people have lunch and then they take a siesta, right? And so if you get a bit tired after having a lunchtime meal, you want to get used to that and figure out ways to mitigate it. So maybe you eat a lighter meal for lunch, or maybe you have coffee or something. But of course, coffee is also a diuretic. You don't want to have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the exam. So also you want to work all of that out now. And so doing a timed exam a week over the next 8 or so weeks could be a way for you to help figure out your flow on that.
Okay. Sounds good.
Cool. Now, I know you had some other questions that relate to timing on the other sections of the exam on games and reasoning. What typically happens for you on those sections?
With games, I guess it would be the inferences, making the inferences, I guess, as fast as I need to get the question correct. I'm kind of getting it now. If I can figure out the diagram, I do get the question, but it just takes time to figure out, okay, that goes there, then that means this can't go there. So it just doesn't come as fast as I guess it should, but I guess with practice, all of that will come.
Yeah, it certainly will get better with time. But then there's also the straightforward rules. There's the rules that are worded in a kind of backwards or confusing way to make you make a typical common mistake. Right. Then there are rules that are more abstract in nature. Now, you emailed me as you prepped for this session. And by the way, thank you so much for sending such a detailed, thorough email. It definitely helps orient our conversation. You said something about kind of feeling dyslexic with the rules.
Correct.
Could you share a bit more about that?
I find often that I just kind of completely misread the rule, or is opposite of what I think the rule is. So I have to go back and everything's kind of mixed up. So I just have to reprogram my way of thinking just because I missed that one rule, or I got it mixed up, or I got it backwards, or something like that.
Yeah, sure. Is there a particular example you want to look at related to this? I know you mentioned something about a game from Test 61. We could definitely take a look at that a little bit just to see what was going on with that rule.
Okay. Oh, was that the one with the unless? I don't have it pull up, but I can pull it up. I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay. No worries. Let's see. It was the first game you mentioned. The first game, I don't particularly see an unless there.
And with this game, it was just very confusing. I couldn't understand it at all to even get the basic diagram down. Mm-hmm. That's the game that you're talking about. And on my note sheet, I had like the one up top was like how I started it. But then I saw that was incorrect. So I started doing the one at the bottom because I noticed in the answers, that's what it was doing. So, but I really couldn't grasp the whole concept at all.
Yeah, sure. Well, this is definitely a pretty tough game. And so I think that as you were correct in saying that, well, I'm not really sure how to diagram it. My intuition's not really getting me anywhere. But then I can look at the orientation question, the first question of the game, and see how LSAC does it. And that can definitely be a good guide to how you might do it. And of course, your diagram won't perfectly represent what they're doing, but it can still give you some indication of where you might want to go with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you ultimately kind of figured that one out for yourself. But one thing I can say just about the initial paragraph, and this is, of course, Test 61, Section 3, Game 1 for those following along, we've got 6 workers and 2 cars, car 1 and car 2, and we're dividing the workers between the 2 cars. And so I would categorize this as a grouping game, in particular grouping splitting, because we're splitting the 6 variables between these 2 cars. And so LSAC laid it out, row 1, row 2, listing the workers in each car. I might draw it as a T chart with 2 columns, car 1 on the left, car 2 on the right, and then listing the people below. And this game is a lot about which people will be together or which will not be together. And so it's a lot of restrictions and blocks of people going together or not.
But I still really don't see how I came up with that graph, even though the LSAT gave it to me. Like, just thinking about it, I wouldn't have came up with that at all.
Well, it takes time, and it takes gaining a lot of familiarity and doing a lot of games. How many games would you say you've done so far?
To be honest, I kind of just started learning games. I was stuck on logic reasoning for a while, but I haven't done that many. I do get the concept.
Well, that's great. And I think that getting the concepts is key, but the LSAT is really almost kind of like a pattern recognition, where you're not looking to reinvent the wheel under timed conditions. There's too much. It's too complex. What you want to do is take your previous knowledge of all the games you've done up to this point and then combine it with what you see in front of you on test day or under timed conditions. And so if you haven't done that many games, it's perfectly natural that you wouldn't have a immediate starting point that comes to mind. What you want to do is you want to do 40 games, 80 games, or even 120 games. And that would be 20 or 30 exams worth of games. And that's not too much. I know it sounds like a lot.
It does.
And it is a lot. But also consider that there's 86 number released exams at this point, and then a handful more that are unnumbered. And the people who get perfect on games are doing a lot of those. They're not necessarily doing all of them or even a majority, but they're doing a couple dozen exams worth of games to build that baseline of understanding, because there are several different types of games and no one single exam will cover all game types. So you might even do 3 or 4 exams worth of games and never see anything like this one.
Right.
And so you're seeing it for the first time. Naturally, it's not going to go well, and that's okay. You can use that as a way to just continue building your foundation. And like I said, if puzzling through it on your own isn't getting you far enough, then definitely go outside, go to the explanations, whether they're my video explanations or written ones or forums and such. There's a lot out there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Let's talk about logical reasoning a little bit. I know you said there were some things going on there with conditionality. You want to share a bit more on that?
Sure. Like I said, I do understand the if-then concept, but I guess just getting it in real life, like just trying to understand the concept in real life. And when I read it on the paper, sorry, my light went off. When I read it on the paper, if it has if and then in it, of course I get it. But even if it doesn't have if and then in it, I still get the concept. But I don't know. I don't know, because sometimes I don't get it, but I do get it.
Yeah, no, I get what you mean. A lot of times people have a good conceptual understanding, but then they can't really articulate it or diagram it or take the contrapositive. And so there's different levels of understanding. There's a level of understanding where you just have a conversation with someone and it naturally flows. But then to actually really force yourself to articulate it and paraphrase it and kind of remix or repurpose it, that's where we see if you truly have a deep enough understanding to avoid LSAC's tricks, because LSAC is very good at masking and disguising things and making familiar concepts seem unfamiliar or more difficult. And so it's definitely worth taking some time to write that out. And so you could even, as part of your review process, write things out by hand or type them or talk with someone else. Find a study buddy, find a partner, find a tutor, even go online and post about it. But it's really important to actually get your words out of your head, because in your head, it's too easy to look at the explanation or the answer key and say, I get it now. It's much harder to actually thoroughly explain it so that somebody else could understand it. So let's just walk through some examples now. I'll just kind of make some up for us together and we can talk through them. So let's say we have the statement, if I eat pizza, then I'll be happy.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty simple, straightforward conditional, right?
Right.
If you were to diagram that, how would you diagram it?
P arrow H.
Perfect. Now, what would the contrapositive of that be?
Negative H arrow negative P.
Perfect. And how would you say that as a sentence?
If I don't have pizza, then I'm not happy.
Okay, so you said not P arrow, not H. But what you said earlier was not H arrow, not P.
Right. Okay, so if I'm not happy, that means that I didn't have pizza. Good.
So is pizza necessary or sufficient for happiness?
Pizza is sufficient for happiness.
Perfect. That's exactly right. So if I eat pizza, then I'll definitely be happy. And that's kind of an extreme statement, because that's saying, like, no matter what else happens, if I eat pizza, then I'm going to be happy. So that means I could have 3 pizza pies in one sitting and I'll still be happy. I won't be too full or uncomfortable or anything like that. Or I could be eating pizza while being like swept up into a tornado. Doesn't matter. The tornado is not going to negate the value of the pizza. The pizza alone is sufficient to guarantee happiness no matter what else is going on.
Right.
And then on the flip side, if you see me not happy, if you see me like crying or sleeping or something else altogether, or angry, then you can infer what?
That you didn't have any pizza.
Perfect. That's exactly right. So I think you've got a good understanding of conditionality as well as the contrapositive.
It's just sometimes on the LSAT, if I was to read pizza makes me happy, I'll still go back and forth. Which one is happy? It sounds simple, but practicing it with you. But if I was to read it, and it's just like, okay, now which one? And I try to say it in my head, okay, which one starts the process and which one is necessary? And I feel like it shouldn't be that hard. Like, if I get the concept, I should understand it, and it should come a lot easier. But sometimes it still doesn't.
Well, I wouldn't be too hard on yourself about that. They're dressing it up. My job is to boil it down and try to simplify it as much as possible. So it's natural that it's going to be easier with me when we're having a conversation about it. But the LSAT, first of all, they're not talking to you. They're writing it down. They're using all sorts of tricks and difficult vocabulary and difficult concepts. They're also making it boring. I've never seen an LSAT question about pizza. I have seen one or two about pizzerias and coupons. There's a tough question on that. But just straightforward, simple things like this, they don't tend to do that very often. So I'd be thinking more about just leveling up bit by bit. And so you could start off doing some simple drills with conditionality and some of the easier logical reasoning questions, and then move up from there. But there's a lot of ways they'll make things more complex. Like, they'll require you to take the contrapositive. They'll require you to link together multiple conditional statements. They'll use more uncommon conditional indicator words. They'll also use words like unless, except, until, and without, which are a whole nother category of things. And so there's a lot going on that they'll do. Mm-hmm. And so a more difficult question, like one in the late teens or early 20s in a logical reasoning section, they'll actually have maybe 5 tricks in a single question. And so if you fall for any one of those 5, you could get it wrong, even if you understood the other 4.
Gotcha.
So I'd say start off with the first 10, and just as an exercise, draw out every conditional that you see. One other thing related to this I want to touch on just before we wrap up is the idea of evidence and conclusion as well, because that kind of relates to this also.
Right.
So we were saying, if you're trying to figure out what's the sufficient, what's the necessary, if you have an argument, that could also be phrased as evidence, conclusion, just the same. If you have an argument where they say, because I ate pizza, therefore I was happy, we could then extract a general principle out of that. that we could frame as a conditional, saying, if someone eats pizza, then they will be happy. If that general principle were valid, that could then be applied to the specific argument in the stimulus with the because, therefore. So evidence is kind of parallel to the sufficient condition, and the necessary is kind of parallel to the conclusion.
Okay.
Because the evidence is the kind of the Kickstarter,
right,
and the conclusion is the result.
Okay, that makes sense.
So try to see if you can apply that sort of insight to these logical reasoning questions and see if it unlocks things a little bit.
Okay, sounds good. Probably be emailing you more questions.
Yeah, please feel free to reach out anytime. I do have a couple of things coming up that you could be aware of if you want to join. I've got a Facebook Live coming up tonight at 8:30 Eastern, and that'll be in the Facebook group. Have you seen that?
Yes, sir. I signed up.
Awesome. Oh, great. And then I've also got a couple of webinars on Friday. I'll be sending out the details for those later.
Sounds good.
Oh, well, anyway, thanks for taking the time, and wish you all the best with your prep. Looking forward to seeing you tonight in the Facebook Live.
All right. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Take care, Deva. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.